Now, once you've established whether or not you need to file a return or not, or let's say once you've established you're required to file a return, the next step is understanding what property qualifies as a, um, a property under these rules. And what's defined, what is the definition of a residential property in the circumstance of the UHT Act? And essentially, there's a few things to consider. The main one is any residential property. It doesn't have to be just rental property, but any residential property. So cottages, for example, could potentially fall under these rules, or a pied-à-terre, if you have one. That type of property would be included, as well as residential rental property. But there's limits to it. So multifamily properties, any units, any buildings or houses that have more than 3 units are not captured under these rules, under these laws. So any home from 1 to 3 units is considered a residential property by definition in the Underused Housing Tax Act. Any semi-detached properties, obviously, any duplexes, row houses, or condos all get captured within these rules. It gets a little bit tricky when you're talking about, let's say, mixed use property where there's, as an example, a strip mall, a strip plaza where there's commercial on the ground floor and a couple units or a few units on the second or third floor. There's some play there, and there's some determination that needs to be had as to whether or not the residential portion of the property represents more than 50% of the overall property. And in the event the residential property represents more than 50% total, then you are required to file this UHT return. So it gets a little tricky where, you know, you're working, and unfortunately the government has not defined how to split that up. Like, does the basement get included if that's part of the commercial? What if it's exactly 50-50 in terms of square footage, residential versus commercial? What do you do? They haven't outlined any guidance for that. You know, we would probably err on the side of caution in those circumstances. And we would look at things like how much of the parking is allocated to the commercial units versus the residential units. Maybe you can extend your math out that way to see if you can swing it one way. But anytime we've been advising our clients, any circumstance in where you're unsure or you think you might be at risk of being deemed residential, you should err on the side of caution, file the UHT return, and avoid CRA deeming you to have filed incorrectly or missing the return and penalizing you for it. Because as you'll see in a later slide, the penalties for getting this wrong or not filing are quite punitive. And that's really created the biggest scare for people, because this is all coming into reality quite quickly. So I already mentioned a few of these. I'll just go through a couple more in detail. What residential properties are excluded? So meaning if you are an owner of these types of properties, you do not have to file a UHT return. High-rise apartments, multifamily units, they are exempt from filing the UHT return. Fourplexes, fiveplexes, multiplexes are exempt. Boarding houses, hotels, motels, bed and breakfasts are exempt from filing, and trailer park homes, mobile homes, they are all exempt from having to file a UHT tax return. The tricky one is condos. You got to be careful with these ones, because if you own a condominium or multiple units within a condo building, you have to file a separate UHT return for each condo unit because they're separately titled, they're separately deeded. There's an interesting case for a client of ours. They bought what looks like on the surface a multifamily, an eightplex, a multifamily building, and he owns the entire property. But when you look under the hood, each property is separately deeded, separately titled, and it acts kind of like a condominium corporation. So under that circumstance, although he owns the entire building and it looks like a multiplex, he has 8 separate units and he has to file 8 separate UHT returns. So that's a rare situation, but it does happen. And you know, if anyone of you or anyone you know is in a circumstance like that, you got to be careful. to not miss that, because again, once we get into discussing the penalties, you'll see it's quite punitive to miss these returns. Now, once you've established you are a filer, you are an affected owner, and you have a property that qualifies as needing to have this HST return prepared, the next question becomes, do you owe the 1% tax or not? And so there's certain exemptions to the tax, and they're based on several things. The usage of the property, its availability for use, the ownership, and what else do we have here? We have whether or not the property was available. So what I mean by that, we'll get into the details. Exemptions for tax: if it was your primary place of residence, you do not have to pay the tax. If you have qualifying occupancy, meaning you have a tenant or the unit was rented for at least 180 days, you do not have to pay the tax. You have to file the return, but you do not have to pay the tax. If you are a specified Canadian corporation, meaning you have foreign ownership or a shareholder of the corporation who is a foreign owner, and that individual or group of individuals owns more than 10%, or less than 10% rather, you do not have to pay the 1% tax.